Today, we're very happy to have Vanessa Beeley. She is an independent reporter reporting on current events and politics in the Middle East. Vanessa, thank you very much for agreeing to the interview.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on.
Where precisely are you based? Where's your home base in the Middle East, if that is where you're based?
Yes, it is where I'm based. It's where I've been based pretty much for the last 15 years, on and off. But I was living in Syria for 5 years up until the orchestrated coup that finally overthrew the government last year, December the 8th. The day that I left Damascus was the day that it fell. And I'm now living in Lebanon against the advice of many people who told me to get out of the region. But I didn't want to leave, one, and two, I didn't want to be too far away from Syria, which was really, I considered it my home. I didn't have any intention of leaving it until, of course, the Al-Qaeda takeover happened. And then I didn't, none of us really had any choice.
Yes. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the situation in the Middle East, I'm just curious, a little personal information about you. How did you get involved in Middle Eastern politics, study, history, society?
I kind of grew up in a household that was very involved in the Middle East. My father was a lifelong Arabist. He was British ambassador to the Middle East, including to Cairo during the first Suez crisis. And then he was brought back by President Gamal Abdel Nasser after the Six-Day War because he was the only, as in his words, the only British envoy that he trusted. So my father went back in 1967, and me as a 3-year-old kid, I was with him in Cairo. But even after he retired, which I think was in 1970, he continued lecturing on the Palestine issue. He was Middle East advisor to Ernest Bevin post-Second World War. And the paper that he wrote famously campaigned against the settlement of European Jews in Palestine because, quote, it would lead to decades of bloodshed in the Middle East. So my father and his peers really were the examples that I grew up with. And although as a kid, of course, I wasn't too involved in the politics, but I think to a large degree, I absorbed it through symbiosis. And then when he passed in 2001, and at that point I was working in the corporate world. I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't particularly an activist, although I was obviously very interested in events in the region. I basically went on a sort of personal journey, which ended up with me jacking my job in, going to Egypt, entering Gaza through the tunnels in 2012. And spending at that point about a month in Gaza during the 2012 Israeli aggression, then spent most of the following months between Egypt and Gaza, and then back in Gaza in 2013. And then basically for health reasons, I had to come back to Europe. But then almost immediately I started following what was going on inside Syria. And then it just went from there, really. And I never really intended to become a journalist, but I just wrote about what I saw and I photographed what I saw. And then, of course, once you've seen the atrocities that are being committed against humanity here in this region, by Western neocolonialist nations, or let's say imperialist nations, because I don't think they ever gave up on the idea of colonialism in one way, shape, or form anyway. Right. No. So I think, labeling it neo gives an idea that there was a hiatus, but I don't actually believe there was any kind of a hiatus at all. Once you've seen it and knowing that my government, for example, the UK regime is largely responsible for most of it. It became a moral, without wanting to sound too holier than thou, it became a question of conscience. I couldn't turn away from it, and I couldn't unsee it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say that you never intended to be a journalist. I think the best, most honest journalists are the ones who never intended to be a journalist, honestly.
Yeah, yeah.
Far more than someone who, say, has gone through Columbia Journalism School.
Or the BBC that are constantly telling me I'm not a journalist because I didn't go through the establishment track to journalism and therefore my journalism can't be considered rigorous, says the BBC channeling MI6 and the British government foreign policy.
Yes, it's like NPR channeling CIA. Do you get the same feeling of like revulsion when you listen to the BBC that I do when I listen to the morning news, the morning edition on NPR? I wonder.
Well, I try not to listen to it, but
Yeah.
I've actually come under such a concerted attack from the BBC in particular. I mean, there was one BBC series called Mayday that ran for 15 episodes, and it was 15 episodes of attacking my work. So I've become very accustomed to the BBC, but not in a good way at all. No. And the correspondence between myself and the producer of the series, I will publish it all one day because it was fairly interesting. Yes. And I have to say she was reduced to near hysteria on various occasions because I think she found me frustrating because I wasn't, giving up on not even my narrative, on the narrative that was actually coming from the Syrian people and had been coming from them since the beginning of the regime change war against them, but of course had been disappeared by the BBC, Channel 4, NPR, CBC, all of them.
Yep. Now, of course, the nature of the news in Iran right now is so immediate. And here at KLA, we're going to try to get this out quick. But just this opening dialogue between us, you have so much experience over there. I want to ask a couple side questions. I want to talk about Palestine, Gaza, and Syria too. But you mentioned those tunnels. Are the tunnels completely closed now between Egypt and Gaza? Is there any way for them to get out?
The tunnels largely were not necessarily, it's difficult to explain. The tunnels were smuggling tunnels, basically. They were also people smuggling tunnels. Mm-hmm. But certainly during the genocide that's been increased since October the 7th. I won't say it started on October the 7th because of it began way back in 1917.
Most people say it started in 48.
No, it didn't. It started in 1917 with the Balfour Treaty and the giving of Palestine, to the Rothschilds, basically. Right. And from that point on, of course, the European settlers started to come in force. 1948 was basically after the British had left and handed it over to the UN to carve up the country in favor of the Zionists. And so that was what basically led to the intensive ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Of course, under the training of the British, particularly a British general, Orde Wingate, who trained the Haganah in how to successfully ethnically cleanse entire villages and towns in Palestine. Mm-hmm. So, the tunnels, to my knowledge, are still open. But of course, Egypt now, the entire border section is now under the control of the IOF. Or the IDF, as you probably know, but we call it the Israeli Occupation Forces, not the Defense Forces, because using the terminology of defense just plays into their narrative of this self-defense, preemptive.
It's like we used to call the Secretary of Defense the Secretary of War, which is a little bit more accurate.
Yeah, exactly. I think we should kind of distort the titles they give themselves because they're always misleading anyway in whatever sector you're talking about. So it's under the control of the IOF and of the Egyptians, of course. And of course, since 1979, when Sadat signed the Camp David agreement, Egypt has pretty much normalized with Israel and increasingly has collaborated with Israel in persecuting the Palestinians and in facilitating and enabling the genocide. I mean, during the very early days of the aggression since October the 7th, Egypt was charging Palestinian civilians, even injured civilians, $5,000 to leave Gaza. And by the way, they were not being given a visa or residency in Egypt. They were given 3 months visa. So effectively, all of those who left are now illegal refugees inside Egypt under Egyptian law, so they can be deported back to Gaza.
Now, what is the reason for Egypt's siding against the Palestinians with Israel? Is it the fact that Egypt is top three, maybe number one or number two of the second largest recipient of American foreign aid? Does that have something to do with it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That has a lot to do with it. Yeah, I mean, basically, I keep saying that I see Egypt as the Ukraine of West Asia. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it's completely bought out. It's no longer a sovereign country, in my opinion. In the description of a sovereign country, it's no longer a sovereign country. Why? Because it's completely in debt to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the EU, to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE that are buying up much of the Sinai, for example,
Yes.
the desert between Gaza and Palestine and the Suez Canal. And then, of course, you cross the Suez Canal into central Egypt. So in my opinion, the Egyptian government is incapable of acting on behalf of Palestine because it's completely in hoc to the US and to the entire US alliance. And as I said, they were among the first to normalize with Israel back in 1979, effectively. Of course, we've seen since then, under Trump's first administration, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, brought in the Abraham Accords, which again was to bring in to the circle of normalization Arab Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE and even Sudan and Morocco were among the first to normalize with Israel. Saudi is kind of dragging its heels, but not out of any concern for the Palestinians, I hasten to add.
Do you think that the Egyptian population sees it like you do, that their own government is bought and paid for by Western interests, specifically the United States?
Largely, yes. I mean, Egypt is, what is it now? It's 100 million population. Most of the population is very uneducated, well below the poverty line. And yes, most of them join the army because there's nothing else to do.
Yes.
Egypt, I have to say, of all my experiences, the 6 months or so that I spent in Egypt, I think I had more near-death experiences than in any other country. It's an incredibly unstable country. There are multiple factions within Egypt. But there are parties, there's fringe parties like the Nasserite Party, for example, that definitely supports the liberation of Palestine and justice for Palestinians. But, Sisi rules with martial law. And so yes, therefore, it's very difficult for anyone. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, but the recent Sumud convoy that came in from Tunisia through Algeria and Libya. And then there was another gathering of people, thousands of people that tried to fly in to march to the Rafah border that divides Egypt from Gaza. And effectively, they were either deported or beaten up or put in prison temporarily. And this is Egypt. Even though my papers were completely in order, when I actually arrived at the border, I was told I couldn't go through. I waited for 3 days and then made the decision to go through the tunnels because this was the third time that I tried and the third time that I'd been turned away. And I have to also say that it's one of the most humiliating experiences for Palestinians trying to cross the Rafah border. The Egyptians are deliberately sadistic towards them, even for Palestinians going from Egypt back into Gaza. And this was during wartime. They treat them, they completely dehumanize them in the same way that the Zionists do.
I just can't imagine that. I can't imagine, given everything that's going on in the Middle East, that you would have a Muslim soldier on the Egyptian side treating a fellow, probably a Muslim, could be a Christian, but treating a fellow Muslim the way they do, in the face of this obvious enemy 20 miles away, you know?
Yeah, I mean, just to explain to people, though, so that they can have a visual of what the border is like, it's
Yeah.
controlled by the Zionists, and the border itself is controlled by the Zionist intelligence. So, for example, even though I had all my papers, I'm guessing because of my father's history and the
Yeah.
name is quite recognizable, I
Right.
was spun every time once I got into the intelligence office, and they would sit there smiling at me like the gently smiling crocodile, and then basically, no, go back to El Arish, which is the coastal area very close to the Rafah border, and come back in the morning. Now, bearing in mind, El Arish, even back then, was a hotbed of smugglers and thieves and gangs that could quite happily kidnap a foreigner. You know, you were being
Yeah.
sent back into a fairly dangerous situation. And then, once you even get permission to cross, you can't walk across. You have to take a bus, because I'm trying to remember how many meters of tarmac it is. It's not very far, around 500 meters, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
You can only take the bus because the Zionist surveillance points are all along that kind of no man's land strip. So if you tried to walk, or if you got off the bus at the wrong point, you'd be shot.
Shot.
Yeah.
And I assume that's happened.
Yeah, I think actually when I was there in 2012, there were some Palestinians that tried to get out of Gaza and got stuck in that no man's land. And actually, they were fired on also by the Egyptians at that point, from memory.
So, what was it, about a week ago now, that the Freedom boat that Greta Thunberg was on was boarded in international waters and prevented from going to the coastline of Gaza. Is there a complete embargo on everything? I mean, the last thing is I heard they shut down the internet. So is it truly the case that no food is being allowed into Gaza?
Yeah, it's an extermination camp. I mean, there's, before it was a concentration camp. Now it's an extermination camp. And the extermination camp itself, I mean, Gaza is about 40 kilometers by 12 kilometers. For me in the UK, that would be the size of the Isle of Wight. It's tiny.
Yes.
And you have a population of 2 million. Now that population, which has probably been reduced by about 200 to 300,000, conservatively speaking. The article in The Lancet, which was about 6 months ago, put the deaths at around 200,000. And that's, not even accounting for the bodies that are still under the rubble and that are being consistently reburied under the rubble with repeat bombings in areas that have already been obliterated. But those 2 million people now are being pushed into an area that is, I don't know, I think about 1/6 of that surface area, the original surface area of Gaza. And then they're being bombed. So they're effectively being cattled into smaller and smaller extermination camps, starved, deprived of clean water, and bombed. And then, of course, the ridiculous Zionist-backed aid centers that have been established with US military special operatives running it. And Palestinians can only get food after they go through facial recognition process, which for me is just, I mean, this, what I keep saying to people, what is happening to Palestinians is a forerunner of what's going to happen to us if we allow the surveillance state in the West to come through. And who effectively is behind the creation of that surveillance state? It's pretty much Israeli tech companies and organizations like Unit 8200, which is the spy unit of the IOF, of the Israeli military, which Iran has just bombed aspects of. And then, of course, they're getting fired on because Netanyahu is arming ISIS factions that were radicalized inside Gaza and that are now being weaponized against the civilians in Gaza and killing them in the aid queues. So it's not only the IOF
that's who you're
killing
referring
them.
to. Yeah, that's who you're referring to when you say they. People lining up for food or water.
Yeah.
Specifically being targeted by snipers and missiles and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a slaughter. And of course, if you think about it, it's perfect for the Zionists, because instead of having the young men, which for them are the potential future resistance fighters, right?
Yes.
Instead of having them in areas that's more difficult to bomb, why not bring them all out into the open, put them in lines, queuing up for food, where there's already going to be organized chaos, and then you can pick them off with sniper fire. You can shell them from the sea. You can bomb them with the drones or the helicopters or the planes. I mean, this is just, I'm trying to think of a comparison in history, but I mean, it's demonic what they're actually doing.
Yeah, I was when you were saying trying to think, I'm trying to think of the language one could use to describe this. And do we have anything that describes that level of deviance and devilry? I mean, it's beyond the pale. But
yeah, no, it's very difficult. I run out of superlatives.
Exactly.
And it's, you're trying not to go into hyperbole to describe what's happening, but it's very difficult to avoid it because it is pure evil, actually, what they're doing. It's pure sadism. When you hear about the rape in State Amman, one of the biggest prisons of Palestinian prisoners, when doctors, like his name has just escaped me now, but the doctor that was kidnapped relatively recently, and it is being tortured to death. And that includes rape, and rape of kids. And when we talk about hostages, there's 9,000 hostages, Palestinians, in Zionist prisons, but nobody ever mentions them. When you get the government statements, either in the US or the UK, they talk about the hostages, the all-hallow hostages, the Zionist hostages, but they never mention the Palestinian hostages, never. Like, they shouldn't be released. They should remain rotting and dying in Zionist jails.
Well, as George Bush Jr. would say, those people in those jails are terrorists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you feel you've been warned not to even be in Lebanon? Do you think Israel has their hands tied so much with Gaza and Iran that Lebanon is safe for now?
No. Israel is still bombing southern Lebanon on a daily basis. It never, according to the ceasefire agreement, it should have withdrawn completely. It hasn't. It has still occupied 5 of the highest points in southern Lebanon, from which it's launching attacks every day against the Lebanese civilians, particularly those trying to come back to their farms and houses in the south. And actually, I was at dinner with friends of mine from Daher, which is the Beirut southern suburb that was heavily bombed during the last war last year, just before Syria fell. And suddenly Israel issued these evacuation notices that they regularly put out with identified 4 buildings in Daher. And one of the buildings, or at least 2 of the buildings, were very close to her home. And their kids and family were still in the home. So she had about 10 minutes to send an Uber to go and try and pick up the family and bring them to safety. But of course, everyone was trying to do the same. And this is despite the Lebanese army saying to Israel through the communications committee, look, don't bomb these buildings. We will go to these buildings and check them for you and inform you that there are no weapons, there are no Hezbollah, Lebanese resistance. There's nobody in these buildings for you to target them and destroy them. And Israel completely ignored it.
Vanessa, you said that the UN was key in helping Israel get started, that they were actually that they were a key component in the beginnings of Israel as a state, correct? So my question is, since then, there have been numerous UN resolutions against Israel. But here's what I'm thinking. Every time one of these resolutions comes up, of course, the U.S. is on the Security Council, and they're going to veto it, right? We know that.
Yes, exactly.
The U.S. and some
and UK
and Micronesia. Yeah. So I'm wondering, what I want to ask you is a couple things. When these resolutions come up, from start to finish, from creating the resolution to debating it and then voting on it, is everybody aware from start to finish that it ain't going nowhere because of
absolutely.
the yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I will give you an example, just a very personal example. When I was working in Syria and I was investigating the accusations of organ trafficking by an organization called the White Helmets, which was established by the CIA and the MI6 as a so-called first responder unit that was embedded with Al-Qaeda in Syria. And I was basically given a meeting with the then, or let's say, a very high level, because it was an off-the-record meeting, so I don't want to name them. But it was a very high-level EU official at the UN. And effectively, they listened to me and they looked at the evidence that I presented for about 45 minutes. And at the end of it, they said, look, everyone in the UN understands that this is probably going on, but it's a political issue. And none of the backers of this organization are going to allow either an investigation or any kind of inquiry or condemnation. Heaven forbid there's a condemnation of the White Helmets. And they actually said to me, the only way you will get this information out is through one of the countries that has the influence in the UN and can at least put the information into public view in the UN. And of course, in the end, it was Russia. And Russia actually ran a panel on the White Helmets and the organ trafficking after it was a Russian NGO. I'm trying to think. I can't remember the name, but it was Maxim Grigoriev, who was one of the founders of the NGO, who ran the investigation for about a year. And we then did a UN panel. And I have to say, we were extremely vilified for doing it, just as I was for appearing at the Geneva Press Club to talk about it. I mean, that was unbelievable how the UN attacked me. And actually, we had to bring in extra security to the Geneva Press Club because all of the extremist factions in Switzerland and Germany had been triggered to come and attack the event. And they were dog whistled by UN officials who were attacking me at the time and tagging them into then tweets before they became posts.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Russia, and I also think about China too, just as if Israel gets into a tight situation, we can count on Uncle Sam coming to the rescue with the cavalry. Do you think that if Iran gets in a tight situation where the regime is in danger of being toppled, that Russia or China would offer their aid?
That's a very interesting question, and it's a question that we're all discussing at great length. I think the consensus is no, not directly. Russia has recently signed a strategic partnership with Iran, but there is no mutual defense pact. And in my opinion, that's because of Russia's relations with Israel.
Yeah.
And the feeling here in Lebanon, particularly from the resistance, is, and I think Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, who of course was the leader of the Lebanese resistance and was assassinated by the Zionists last year, he actually said, Russia has come to the aid of Syria, but we don't consider it, I'm paraphrasing, we don't consider Russia to be an ideological ally. And I think that's absolutely correct. Russia has, I think, more than 1 million Russian Israelis inside Israel. Mm-hmm. And it has long-standing relations with Israel. China is a little bit different, but China has a policy of just not getting involved in military conflict. It trades with everyone, and that includes Israel, of course. It has invested in the Haifa port. And for China, it has huge economic interests in the region. So in my opinion, from a very sort of cynical point of view, it will work with whoever has the power in the region, basically, is my opinion. There isn't, again, this ideological adherence to any kind of resistance to either Israel or the US particularly. But what I would say is I think they're both aware that if Iran were to fall, then potentially China and Russia are next. And so there is an element of, in my opinion, it's very complex because I mentioned the fact that with the strategic partnership, Russia doesn't have a mutual defense pact. It does have a mutual defense pact, for example, with North Korea. But for Putin, how it's been explained to me here is he has huge respect for countries that have maintained their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. And even like Iran, who've been under sanctions, were faced with the Iran-Iraq war and then had very heavy sanctions imposed upon them. And yet not only have they survived, they've to a degree flourished and to a degree managed to develop their defense industry to a point where now they are demonstrating quite how advanced and sophisticated that defense industry is, right? And so Putin works on this. For him, the Middle East is too complicated. It's too messy, and sovereignty is very questionable thanks to the British and the French from the Sykes-Picot onwards. Right. But for countries that are still, if you like, entire and still have their entire territorial sovereignty, then Putin is very respectful of them. So I think there is a great degree of respect for Iran. And I think there may be an element of coming to the aid of Iran, particularly, but perhaps through a third party or indirectly. That's my speculation on it, knowing how Russia thinks and works. And I would also speculate that China might do the same. Because in the recent skirmish between Pakistan and India, we saw the supremacy of Chinese weapons against what are effectively NATO weapons being used by India. And if China is supplying Pakistan, and Pakistan has come out quite strongly in support of Iran, and actually kind of the Islamic resistance in Pakistan have just put out an incredibly strong statement saying that if the US does get involved, which is looking increasingly likely that they will, then the Islamic resistance in Pakistan is going to be triggered, basically, and they will start attacking US bases in the region. So I think there's potential for China and Russia to, under the radar, come to the help of Iran.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say Putin respects countries that can maintain their sovereignty as long as there's, I guess, a degree of cohesion within that country. So is that why Putin decided to give up on Syria? Did he decide to give up on Syria? Can you, in a nutshell, explain why Russia got out of there?
I mean, bear in mind that I was on the ground during the last days. So I was on the ground, not in Aleppo, but I was in Hama and Homs and Tartus as they were falling, and in Damascus. And while communications were largely down, the communications that I received both during and after the advance of Al-Qaeda demonstrated to me that Russia had largely decided to abandon at least the government in Syria. Now, to some degree, I'd been predicting this when Trump was elected, because this is what Trump does. Trump is brought in to be the deal maker, right? And the deal breaker, largely, as he was with Iran in his first administration. And I always remember back in 2016, because I don't know how you feel, but I don't see there any difference between the presidents, just in their way of running that section of the roadmap, which is established by the deep state, the Pentagon, and the ruling elite that are not visible behind the throne of power. Yeah. When Trump was first elected in 2016, it was actually very clever, because it kind of threw the entire resistance axis, including Russia, into a bit of confusion, because everybody thought that they could get a deal including even Iran. They thought then they could renew negotiations on the nuclear deal and so on. And of course, what happened? Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, which again, if people want to read the history of that, go to the Brookings Institute strategy paper, Which Path to Persia, which lays it out exactly, including Trump's role in both administrations. But that's a bit of a distraction. Mm-hmm. And so I think as soon as Trump was elected, there were negotiations between him and Putin over resolving the Ukraine issue, because this was one of the slogans that Trump was elected on, that he would end the war between the NATO war with Russia in Ukraine. And so I think that there were already back channel negotiations going on between Putin and Trump. And one of those was to basically allow al-Qaeda to come to power in Syria. But from a Russian perspective, bearing in mind again what I said, that there was no ideological alliance for Russia in Syria or in the Middle East. It was a very pragmatic alliance in the sense that it had maintained a military base and a naval base on the eastern coastal section of Syria for the past, I think it's now 60 years or so. Mm-hmm. And it needs that base for its adventurism in Africa, for example, for its to maintain a footprint in West Asia, which of course is the gateway to Eurasia, as described by Zbigniew Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard, right? So for Russia, it was very important to maintain a foothold in Syria, but that was it. Apart from that, I think in the end, President Assad was not complying with Russian pressure. He wasn't pivoting fast enough to the Gulf states. And of course, pivoting to the Gulf states away from Iran and the resistance factions would Russia ultimately, yeah. That's what they were pushing for, which effectively is normalization with Israel, right? Which is not what they've now achieved with Jolani, with the head of al-Qaeda and formerly ISIS, who's now the unelected president in Syria. They've pushed him to the point where, he'll normalize with Israel. So they've achieved it because they couldn't achieve it with Assad. His last speech at the Arab League summit, he basically shamed the Gulf states for their lack of support for Palestine. So those were one of his last speeches. And I think also the fact that he wouldn't come to the negotiation table with President Erdogan of Turkey, who had, of course, early on in the war against Syria, had annexed territory in the north of Syria and sort of heading towards the industrial city of Aleppo in the north. So I think there were a number of reasons that Russia lost patience, basically. But it could have been, in my opinion, it could have been done differently without bringing in al-Qaeda to rule the country and now be conducting ethnic cleansing programs against Syrian minorities everywhere across Syria. It could have been done differently and more responsibly.
When you mention Putin wanting Assad to gravitate more towards the Gulf states instead of Iran, the thing that jumped into my head is, Putin is under the same kind of pressures from the same kind of people that our governments are under.
Yeah, and I kind of think that's becoming more apparent now.
Yeah.
I remember back in, I think it was 2017, having a meeting again with a very high-level Russian official working inside Syria, and not only him actually, but even people at the UN mission in Geneva back then. They never saw Iran as an ally. They saw it as a necessary contender for influence inside Syria, but it was definitely seen as competition. So in my opinion, for Russia, it's as advantageous for them to reduce Iranian influence in the region as it is for Israel, in all honesty. And that's despite, this strategic partnership that they've just signed with Iran. So it's very complex, but I kind of understand it. From having lived in Syria, I understand that basically what happened in the end is, in my opinion, is President Assad put too much trust in Russia. He expected them to ideologically have his back, and they didn't. And that ultimately also was part of what led to the downfall of the government.
Does this thought pop into your head? You could say it's a it's a neocon dream from the likes of people like Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken to see Russia fail. And so Russia is in a fight for their lives against this type of thing. And yet they're doing things in the Middle East that favor neocon dreams, like aligning themselves with wanting more of an alliance with these wonderful Gulf states rather than Iran.
Well, and also, I think it was within 6 weeks of Damascus falling that Bogdanov, the deputy foreign minister, was one of the first to come to Damascus and normalize Jolani, or Ahmed al-Sharaa, as he's now known. And then I'm pretty sure that, well, no, I know, because Israel has been lobbying the US for Russia to keep its base in Syria. Why? Because another area where Israel and Russia agree is to prevent Turkish neo-Ottoman expansionism. And Israel has been very clearly bombing any attempt by Turkey to advance into central Syria. And they've made it very clear that that's their red line. You don't come any further into Syria. And actually, after Israel was lobbying for Russia, the US removed the condition from their list that they gave Jolani that he has to comply with to remain in power. And initially on that list was the removal of the Russians from inside Syria. And then it kind of flipped. So now Trump, I think it was an interview with Jolani where he said Trump has basically told them, we're not going to give you any more weapons. We did all that in the beginning with Timber Sycamore and so on. We've done enough. Now you can basically rely on Turkey and Russia. And Jolani was saying, well, yeah, most of our weapons are Russian manufactured. Of course, Russia didn't supply them, but they were coming in from the Balkans and so on, Libya in the beginning. And he said, so it makes sense that we continue buying our weapons from Russia. So, I mean, I guess Syria has been a huge lesson for me. I think I was probably way more idealistic before all of this happened. In many ways, I was kind of losing it and becoming more pragmatic in my reading of what was going on. Because living in a country is very different from commenting on it from outside. You get far more of the complexity and nuance when you live in a region that you're reporting on. But honestly, I think Syria, more than any other event, even COVID, I'm sorry to bring, because they're all connected.
Yes.
Syria, more than any other, taught me to be incredibly cynical about governments and their policies, generally speaking.
And
Iran, for me, is very different. Yeah, no, we should never look for heroes.
Yep.
Where I would not correct myself, but where I would perhaps correct the perception that people might take from that. If I look at the resistance axis as it is now, if I look at Yemen and if I look at Iran, for example, so you have two state resistance players there. It's very different because it is an ideology. It's a religious ideology to protect the oppressed. And that's something you may have. I mean, for example, in the Iranian government, it's a complex society because you have an elected reformist government now, and you have the supreme leadership and the IRGC. But you are seeing now unity between the Iranian armed forces and the Republican Guard, and unity across the board in Iran, despite the previous, perhaps, dissatisfaction with some of the policies within Iran, right? But now you're seeing full unity across that. Yes. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very healthy to have a cynicism, not only about governments, but particularly about billionaires. I mean, anyone who was pushing, the whole Trump savior nonsense pre-election, it was very difficult to have debates on social media at that point because people were completely lost. in this idea of this, Trump savior, which for me, like, how can you look at a billionaire and think he's going to save you? He's going to walk across your heads and your dead bodies to the next profit-making project that he's looking at. And of course, that's exactly what he's doing in Gaza. He looks at it as waterfront estate,
Yeah.
right? Which is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, of course, influencing him there also.
What did you think about that video he made, the clever CGI video, sitting drinking pina coladas on the beach in Gaza? Baby.
God. I mean, this is just, it's the height of depravity. This is...
Considering what's going on at the same time they make this video.
Whenever I see stuff like this, I studied Italian literature for my sins at A-level, and I'm reminded of Dante's Inferno. The levels of sin, the 7 levels, is it 7? Yeah, the 7 levels of...
9 levels.
And this is what I think of when I look at, really, to a large degree, what Western society is being forced to become. If you're not aware enough of what's going on, you're absorbing and digesting stuff like this on a daily basis. And it's literally kind of, this is the war against us as humanity. And this is what I'm always trying to say. What is going on in Iran, what's going on in Yemen and Palestine and here in the region, what's going on in Syria, it's all connected. This is one war against the same enemy. And all of it is about dehumanization of all of us and the reducing of our ability to be human to as low a level as possible, where we accept through Hollywood, through ridiculous AI videos like this. But it's all about normalization of genocide. It's all about normalization of the oppression of entire peoples and the theft of resources and the piracy of entire countries and the reduction of what is mockingly called the global south to a regressive, undeveloped region of the world, when in reality, it has the majority of the world's resources.
Yes.
It's criminal. Sorry, that was a rant.
No, that's okay. That's okay. We're fighting against the same enemy. Who is the enemy? I mean, C.J. Hopkins calls it global capitalism. David Icke calls it the cult. Pat Buchanan would call it the neocons. So who's the enemy?
Well, I mean, I think you look at, this is when people sort of reduce it down to being the Russian government, the Chinese government, they're all in on it and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's entirely the case. I think there is a transnational oligarchy, if you want to call it global cap, whatever you want to call it. But it's the extremely wealthy predator class that control the majority of all sectors upon which we rely for our existence and ultimately for our dignity as human beings, whether that is natural resources, whether that is oil, whether it doesn't matter, the environment. I mean, for example, the whole climate change agenda. Who ever talks about what damage the military-industrial complex does to the planet? Nobody. It's never mentioned at a single one of these Agenda 2030 Davos meetings, ever. Because war means profit. War means keeping the GDP at an acceptable level, particularly in the US, of course. Now, I would also argue when people talk about combating Israel, it goes beyond Israel for me. You go then into the entire Zionist movement. And I would recommend that everybody follows Dr. David Miller on X because he's done seminal work in investigating the growth and expansion of the Zionist movement itself. And he also just won a kind of landmark legal case in the UK where it was actually, he was sacked from his university for addressing the issue of the Zionist movement. He went to court, and it was actually ruled that it is perfectly acceptable to criticize the Zionist movement because it's a political entity. It's not related to religion, as much as they would try and weaponize religion to increase their popularity, of course. But if you look at US government, if you look at UK government, EU government, I mean, I sort of jokingly call it the UK, the United Kingdom of Israel, because most policies now are in defense of Israel. The fact that Hamas and Hezbollah, the two resistance factions, one in Palestine, one in Lebanon, are prescribed terrorist organizations in both, I think, the US and the UK, definitely in the UK. What threat are they to UK national security? None. What threat are they to Israel's national security? And if you look at the UK-Israel 2030 roadmap, it's terrifying, because you will see the extent to which Israel has captured every single sector of British society, from health to education to Ministry of Defence to government, to surveillance to cyber to, and that's what I'm saying. When you look at what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians for decades, all of the AIs, the 15-minute city where you have automatic rifle, I don't know what you call them, watchtowers, and they can be triggered by remote control and just pick off Palestinians in the street. There's videos out there of this happening. And so therefore, everything that you're seeing being introduced into the West is very much Israeli technology, Zionist technology.
As you say that, I say to myself, and we are supposed to believe that this level of technology, Iron Dome, whatever they have, the trillions or the, let's say, 100 billions we send Israel somehow wasn't spent on the border. And the Hamas was able to penetrate that quite easily and do their work for 8 hours before any response came about. How can we expect anybody to swallow that?
Yeah, I mean, that's you've hit on a relatively contentious subject for many, even on the side of the Palestinians, because many are putting out the line that Israel actually created Hamas. To some degree, it collaborated with Hamas to weaken Fatah and to totally weaken the PFLP. They funneled money to them.
Okay.
But what people don't understand, and to be honest, Hamas was involved in the destabilization of Syria up until 2017. But that was with the old leadership of Khalid Mashal and a number of others. From 2017, Saad Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, worked on Hamas to basically bring them back into the resistance axis and away from the Qatari, Saudi Arabia money. And the leadership changed. And the resistance factions that are now fighting, mostly the Qassam brigades, which were the military arm of Hamas anyway, who were never on board with the Hamas political policy, to be honest. They were against any kind of collaboration with Israel. So again, it's very complex. Yes. But the resistance that are now fighting, and that included Yahya Sinwar, who of course was martyred in Gaza very recently, and the majority of the Hamas leaders who were killed both in Lebanon and in Palestine. And of course, Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran. They were on board with the resistance axis and obviously genuinely fighting against the Zionist occupation. So I think my opinion is that the attack on October the 7th, while, yes, I agree with you, Israeli surveillance does have a reputation of being like number one in the world. And to a large degree, they've had huge success, even very recently in Iran, in the first sort of 6-7 hours of the aggression, which was pretty horrifying to sit through. At the same time, I do think there was a degree of success from Hamas. But what I think happened is that they saw an opportunity to turn this into the pretext to carry out the ethnic cleansing that began on October the 7th. And that is why they killed their own civilians. That's why the Hannibal Doctrine was introduced, to actually massacre their own civilians and blame it on Hamas. And in the very sort of first few days, I remember doing an interview within hours of it all kicking off. And the person who was running the interview was kind of horrified by some of the images. I said, okay, we need to take a deep breath, and we need to sit back and remember to what extent the Zionists have lied over the last 100 years, right? Yeah. And sure, gradually, time over time, it all came out that the majority of it was fabricated. I mean, who was it? The Zaka or Zalka? I can't remember, the Zaka organization. I mean, the head of that organization has been prosecuted for pedophilia, for heaven's sake. Yeah. And they've basically, it's been proven that over time that the majority of the narratives that were being run by the Zionists very early on to justify the beginning of this genocide in earnest were fabricated.
Yeah, I think you can still tune into conservative radio here, people like Mark Levin, and you can hear them talking about babies in ovens and mass rapes and stuff on October 7th. It's like everybody has forgotten the Kuwaiti babies in incubators story. It just repeats. Yeah. Do you think that, well, first, a different question. I was listening to Nick Fuentes' monologue the other day, and he said, Iran wants a de-escalation. The Europeans want a de-escalation. America wants a de-escalation. Probably Russia and China. Up to that point, would you agree with that? That well, I don't know about America, but ostensibly, let's say, that at least those countries are looking to stop this war, stop this. No. Which ones are actually in favor of getting continued? Okay, maybe leave America out of the equation. The rest of it.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely obvious that America is itching to get in there. And again, if you go back to the Brookings Institute strategy paper, look, Trump is sending, how many planes has he just sent to Guam, the B-2 bombers that are capable of dropping nuclear? Sure. Because if you look at the Atlantic Council and Chatham House and a number of kind of Republican media outlets that have been putting out, they've been manufacturing consent for Trump to bomb the Fordo nuclear facility in Iran. And the only way, because I think it's something like 80 meters below ground. So even if Israel were to use the bunker buster bombs, they're not going to go deep enough because those will only go down to 60 meters. So the only thing that's going to hit it is a tactical nuke. And that's what they're all pushing for. And if you look at the Brookings Institute strategy paper, that is basically what it advocates for, is bombing the nuclear facilities in Iran. So in my opinion, it's coming down the pipeline. Britain has already sent support. It's been supporting Israel from Cyprus, but also it's been providing the surveillance over Gaza for Israel, right? And Keir Starmer's already kind of committed to sending equipment and so on to help Israel. Trump was sending laser-guided missiles. The whole negotiations pantomime, and it was a pantomime, the falling out with Bibi pantomime. This was all nonsense. This was all buying time to be able to supply the weaponry and perhaps even help with the intelligence and the strategy for Israel against Iran in the first few days. So, and Chancellor Merz in Germany, I mean, he's actually come out and said, well, great, Israel is fighting our war against Iran. What war? When was Germany ever at war against Iran? But he's publicly come out with that. And they're now supplying weapons to Israel, right? Yes. So it's absolute nonsense that that anyone wants de-escalation. Look at the European 3, the E3. What were they doing just before this aggression? They were pushing for the snapback mechanism. So back to the sanctions, the heavy sanctions on Iran, because they weren't complying with the IAEA. And what did the IAEA do? It pulled the convention in the UN to say Iran was not complying. All of this was a green light to Israel to attack. And now the IAEA, Grossi, he's now backtracking and saying, no, Iran wasn't developing a nuclear weapon. It's too late. You've manufactured the consent for Israel to bomb, because the 30-year gag that has been running since 1992, that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. Surely if they had wanted to develop nuclear weapons, it would have been done by now. And who has nuclear weapons? Israel has nuclear weapons that are not part of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. They have not been investigated. It's a secret nuclear program. And they have the Samson Doctrine, which was established, the Samson Option, which was established under Ariel Sharon. And basically, what does that say? It says that if Israel faces an existential threat, it has the right to use nuclear weapons. So who is the unstable adversary in this orchestrated conflict by Israel against Iran?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I can't do the math in my head very quick, but I'm thinking, how many 2-week periods are there in 33 years? Because, right? They're only 2 weeks away, and they've had a few 2-week periods, and they still don't have the bomb. So something's wrong with our intelligence.
But even 2 weeks is ridiculous.
No,
I mean, come on. And remember the bombing of the Iraqi so-called plutonium reactor back in 1981 with US jets by Israel, which again was this narrative that, Saddam Hussein is developing a plutonium reactor. So they bombed it, right? And then they brought in the Begin Doctrine, which basically said that any Arab nation that threatens Israel is not allowed to have nuclear weapons.
Right. Crazy. So obviously America and Israel don't want this thing to de-escalate. Do you think that when the United States was negotiating with Iran just before the Israeli attack on Iran, that they knew, the Americans knew that this attack was coming, and therefore these negotiations were just window dressing? It was just propaganda. Look, we're trying to sue for peace here, and an attack.
But this is what they do, right? Look at the Hamas negotiations. How many times did Hamas accept the US deal back in, when was it? July 2024. And then Israel suddenly added another clause. So of course, Hamas is not going to accept it. And this is what they do. This is what they did to Iran. So initially, Iran's red line was they're not going to stop their missile program, their defense program. And they reserve the right to enrich uranium up to a level for civilian infrastructure and supply of energy and so on. Yeah. And they need it because they're under sanctions, right? So they have absolutely and no one has collaborated more closely with the IAEA than Iran has done. Even President Putin said that a couple of days ago in a statement. He said, it's ridiculous to say that Iran has not complied with the IAEA more than any other country.
So when you say they need it, they need the nuclear power because of the sanctions. This should shut down the argument that says Iran, they got all the oil they need to survive.
No, I mean, look, when I went to Iran in 2022, and this was at the peak of poverty in Syria, I was very impressed with how the Iranian government had maintained supply of gas, of electricity, of water. And in fact, when people were sort of complaining to me about the Iranian economy and how difficult everything was because they were isolated, my answer was, well, you should come to Syria. I mean, we had electricity for 1 hour every 5 hours, something like that. We didn't have fuel. We didn't have water regularly because there was no electricity to pump the water up to the tanks on the roofs, et cetera, right? But Iran was running pretty efficiently. But as far as I know, it's more on the gas front that they have problems. They have potential of a lower supply of gas. The oil, I think, is not a problem. Yeah. So they need I'm not an expert on nuclear energy at all, so I don't really want to get into that subject. But that's my understanding, is that they needed the uranium enrichment, just as many countries have actually that are running off nuclear power. Even Egypt, Russia is developing it in Egypt for similar reasons to some degree. They have problems also.
Okay.
I've forgotten what else I was going to say then. Anyway, never mind.
I kind of have a follow-up question to it.
Yeah.
What about the possibility that, just as we could say that what Israel ostensibly wants in Gaza is really not all they want, because I think they want Gaza, period. They want Palestinians out of Gaza, and they want to claim that land for Eretz Israel, Greater Israel. Could you also say that it might be that Israel would not even be happy with the end of Iranian uranium enrichment? What they actually want is the mullahs out. They want the Iranian regime destroyed, and they're not going to be happy. And they want continued conflict until that is achieved. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And again, I'll redirect you back to the Brookings Institute paper, which, by the way, talks about this persuasion strategy, which began with President Bush in 2005 over the nuclear deal. So that's how long it's been running. And they talk about pushing Iran into a corner and making it look as if Iran is ducking out of negotiations and is obstructing the roadmap to peace and so on. And that's what they do. This is their tactic. They make the other guy look bad so they can bomb them, basically, and remove the government that's standing in their way or is threatening Israeli national security in the region. Iran has never attacked anyone outside its borders. It's surrounded by US military bases, literally surrounded by them, just as is China and Russia, by the way.
Yes. Yes. I looked at your map, and completely surrounded. And what did I think about there? I thought, what does your average Muslim, let's say Arab Muslim, think of the fact that it's only Iran that stands now, and my country and the next country and the next country are all run by the Israeli U.S. Western Empire? Aren't people angry about this? What is it like in the streets of Syria and Lebanon, where you live? I mean, do people realize that they are subjects of a foreign power, let's say?
First of all, if I could very gently correct you, it's not only Arab Muslims. There are Arab Christians, there are Arab Druze, there's Arab Ishmaeli, there's Arab Yazidi, there's multiple ethnic minorities in this region that have coexisted peacefully for decades, including in Palestine. There's a large Christian community both in the occupied territories in the West Bank and even in Gaza. We know because there were Christian churches bombed by the Zionists. Of course, they claim that there are no Christians left. And it has been a project of the West and of the Zionists to drive the Christians out of the region through persecution by their Takfiri project, which is the extremist Islamic factions that were incubated by the Gulf states largely, also by Turkey, if you consider the Muslim Brotherhood. This is going to get even more complicated. But they don't represent Islam. So in the region, you have Christians, you have, as I said, all manner of ethnic minorities coexisting. And all of them, to a degree, are defending Arab identity against what is effectively the new Crusader complex. So this region has been under attack by the Crusaders, and then that attack has never really stopped. So it's gone through the new neo-colonialist complex, the British, the French, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and now you literally have the new Crusader complex that is trying to overrun the region. And of course, Israel is expanding. It's expanded immediately into southern Syria. Its intention is to create what it calls the David Corridor up the eastern flank of Syria, so the eastern border of Syria with Jordan and Iraq, and eventually to enter Iraq up to the Euphrates River. And for Israel, what is this about? It's about the survival of Israel, number one.
Mm-hmm.
because not only from an existential perspective, because where does Israel go now? It can't go back. What's it going to do? Is it going to put its hands up and say, oh, by the way, I've changed my mind, I want peace? Having basically turned the entire region against it through its genocidal campaign, it can't go backwards. It can only go forwards, right? And you're absolutely right. The final goal is regime change in Iran. And the replacement of the supreme leadership, the Islamic leadership, the revolutionary leadership from 1979, with what they would term as a government that it will normalize with Israel, a reformist government that will normalize with Israel. That's what they want. But they also want, as they've done in Syria, to destroy the capability of any country in the resistance axis or in the region of being able to defend itself against Israel or to, in the future, attack Israel. And that's why the first thing it did when Damascus fell was to bomb Syria's entire military capability, including its navy, its air bases, its air defense, its weapon development centers. And that's ongoing. It's still doing that, by the way. And now, of course, it has the potential to use Syrian airspace for its attacks against Iran. So that was another reason why Syria had to fall when it did. And when you start to see, I think it was Jolani in 2015 in an Arabic interview, he said, our goal is to cut the hands of the resistance. So in other words, that means Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. And finally, we go for Iran. And in Iran, we will remove the regime. And we will do this by triggering the Takfiri elements that I have control of, Jolani. But remembering, Jolani is basically handled by the British, by the Americans, by the Israelis, and by the Turkish. Right? So he's channeling their strategy, basically. Mm-hmm. And General Wesley Clark also made it very clear, the 7 countries that would be taken out, finishing with Iran, because Iran is perceived as the head of the resistance axis. I'm not saying that every other country and non-state actor is a proxy of Iran, but Iran is the largest country in that entire span of countries that comprise the resistance axis.
Is Iran the last remaining country on General Clark's list?
Yes.
Okay, we have to finish pretty soon. There was a few questions that came in from my readers, and good ones. One of them, I think you just answered. It says, supposing this conflict doesn't drag the whole world into flux, what do you foresee for the region a decade from now? But if Israel cannot back down, then what else is there besides an Israeli-American victory or an Iranian victory? How can this end peacefully?
I don't think it can. And unfortunately, I do think we are being propelled towards some horrible kind of apocalyptic scene. And why do I think that? Because if you look at the Trump administration, it's packed full of Christian Zionists. I mean, you mentioned Victoria Nuland, but you look at the Christian Zionists, which is an oxymoron in itself. They outnumber Jewish Zionists, by the way. I can't remember the percentage. But they believe in this end time prophecy that the world has to go into an apocalyptic war for the second coming of Christ to come about. Huckabee. And if you listen to some of the statements, from Mike Huckabee, from Lindsey Graham, from a huge number of the members of Trump's administration, and they were all handpicked for this. That's where they're heading. And as crazy as that might sound to many, many people, it's looking almost inescapable. I mean, we're literally bracing ourselves here because if the US enters the war, there are multiple resistance factions, even in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, most recently, that have come out publicly and said if the US either attacks the nuclear facilities or tries to assassinate the supreme leader, we will all enter this war. And this means direct attacks on US bases. It means the bombing of the Gulf state oil facilities. It means the shutting down of the Hormuz Strait. It means direct attacks on American troops. It means body bags coming back to the US, and heaven forbid that happens. But I hope to God that that is what changes public opinion, because something has to.
Well, when you say you hope it changes public opinion, I think that it might be possible that that's what even America wants in order to get the public in a war rage.
Ugh.
Look here, our troops are being shot. Here's some dead troops on TV, and maybe people who were a bit reluctant. Maybe, I don't know, can Fox News and CNN do their magic again and get us all into war fervor?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I would hope that humanity has kind of evolved out of this endless cycle of war and violence, but it appears not. Historically, that's all we've ever done. It's sort of like endless empires falling, rising, genocide after genocide. And we don't seem to be able to evolve out of the endless pattern and cycle of war, of militarism.
Right. Okay, maybe two more questions and then we got to close. How does this end without nukes? Can it?
Oh, well, first of all, Iran doesn't have nukes. Let's just remind people of that. So the nukes are not going to come from Iran.
Right.
They're only going to come from the US or from Israel, potentially, of course, from Pakistan, if you're going to go further down the road. China, Russia are nuclear states, as is Pakistan. I think there is a very high possibility that Trump might be insane enough to use a tactical nuke. They already used it in Yemen in 2015, close to Sana'a on one of the mountains there. I actually helped investigate that with Professor Chris Busby, who's a nuclear specialist who investigated the US attacks of Fallujah and the depleted uranium. So they have already used one, and that was dropped by, I think, a B-2. The fact that Trump is sending the B-2s to Guam, he's already been building up military and naval presence in the region in the last few days, and even before that, actually.
Yes. Today I saw a picture. Go ahead. I saw a picture today. Six B-2s in, I think it was Diego Garcia. Yeah.
Or Guam. I don't know, but he's been building up in Diego Garcia for some time, because even prior to his backpedaling on Yemen, he'd installed B-2s in Diego Garcia, but they weren't used against Yemen. He got out of Yemen because he was being severely embarrassed by Ansarullah, by the resistance movement there. I mean, I don't know, the US lost 3 Super Hornets, lost in inverted commas, that were being chased down by Ansarullah missiles, and 22 drones. And I think the whole cost was over $1 billion. And the Pentagon said, "Can you stop? Because we need these weapons for future wars, obviously against Iran and potentially against China," which is what they were saying to the New York Times and so on.
Yes.
So I do actually think there's a very strong possibility that Trump is going to go ahead and use a tactical nuke against one of the Iranian nuclear development centers, which is Fordo. If that happens, the next stage is going to be not good for the world, basically, in my opinion. And of course, if Iran continues to hammer Israel as it has been doing and causing enormous damage, actually. I mean, this is the first time in history that the Zionists have come under such an attack, having, attacked and aggressed the entire region for the last 100 years to this extent. They're now facing final retaliation. Then we enter the territory of it being an existential threat to the existence of Israel. And then, in my opinion, also there's potential for Israel launching a nuke.
Samson option is.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's real. And Netanyahu, and it's not only Netanyahu, you know, people sort of focus in on Netanyahu, but the reality is 90% of the population of Israel is in favor of the extermination of the Palestinians. The rest of his administration are far more far right than he is, like Ben
Wow.
Gvir and Smotrich
Yeah.
and so on. And in fact, there is, in a sense, a kind of a civil war going on between the Knesset and the re-emergence of gangs like the Ergen gang, the Stern gang, which were the Israeli terrorist gangs that carried out multiple
Yeah.
attacks from 1936 onwards, that are being, the extremist settlers that are being armed and managed by Ben Gvir's security forces
Yeah.
within Israel.
I wonder if Mike Huckabee read Seymour Hersh's book, The Samson Option, and instead of being appalled, he said to himself, "Hey,
great,
catalyst for the rapture." Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. I mean, it sounds almost kind of off the scale to be
It sounds
talking
Monty
about this, but
Python-ish.
kind of. But sadly, it's a reality, and it's something that we will kind of have to face. There is a lunatic fringe at the moment. It's not even a fringe, actually. I wouldn't even describe it as a fringe. It's a very powerful movement for this.
Yes. Yes. Do you see any indication that the United States' support of Israel may wane, and at some point Israel ceases to be the permanent entangling alliance that it has been for decades?
No, in a nutshell, because every single president, every single senator, congressman, that I would say 95% has funding from Zionist organizations, Zionist movement organizations. I mean,
Yes.
not even just AIPAC, but beyond that. There is, again, Dr. David Miller is fantastic on this because he's gone into exhaustive depth as to the expansionism of Zionism into all sectors of society.
Sure.
And those foundations, the Brookings Institute, for example, which influences government strategy and foreign policy, has connections to the US State Department, the CIA, the Ministry of Defense. It was seed funded by the Rockefeller Fund and the Ford Foundation. So, the hidden hands behind the scene, the ones you don't see, are the ones that are actually running government.
Yes. So we're to look for David Miller's work. His name is David Miller, and is he on Substack?
Yeah.
As you are.
Yes,
what is
he
the name
is.
of,
Yeah.
What's the name of your Substack?
Mine is just Beeley, I think. Beeley. But if you look at Vanessa Beeley, I just use my name on every platform. David, on X, he's at Tracking Power.
Okay.
And I think it's the same on Substack. But if you just search for Dr. David Miller, you'll find him, or go to his X page and you'll find all of his websites there. But would probably be a really good guest as well, from a perspective of fully understanding the danger of the Zionist movement.
Okay, good. The other day, I was just looking for the latest news on what was going on in Iran, and I honestly don't know where to go to get up-to-date news, comprehensive news. It's not compromised. So where do you go to get your news, such as breaking news? Is a place like Al Jazeera relatively trustable? What can you do?
No. Al Jazeera is
not even
awful.
relatively.
I mean, no. Al Jazeera were responsible for the beginning of the regime change war against Syria. Qatar put in billions into the funding of terrorists and propaganda against the Syrian government. Yep. So no, not trustworthy at all. There's a news outlet which is Iranian, but it's very good at just sort of news, and that's Tasnim News, TASNIM. If you're on Telegram, you can follow the Persian one, because Telegram will translate into English automatically. Mm-hmm. And that will give you news second by second. So you're getting it very fast. I can send you the links by email. Press TV is not bad. I mean, that's state television again, but it's not bad, at least on covering the events inside Iran. It's pretty good, obviously. But Telegram is good. There are, what I'll do is actually I'll send you a couple of young Iranian commentators on Telegram that do a really good job of covering events and keeping up to date with everything that's happening. And also pushing back against the fake news, because there's a lot of it. Reuters is doing a great job at the moment of literally fairy tailing anything to do with Iran.
Okay, very good. And I might mention KLA TV is not a bad source either. That's where we come from.
Exactly.
Well, Vanessa Beeley, thank you so much for this extended interview. We went double time. Sorry for that, but I'm sure our viewers are going to love this. And we're very honored to have you on today.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, God bless you for your work. Keep it up, and we'll see you.
Take care.